We've made it to our final plenary, and I hope you'll give this one your utmost attention because it's going to be a great discussion. As our field matures, we have to recognize that we aren't operating in a vacuum, right? We're part of a broader, rapidly evolving community safety ecosystem, and one of the most critical relationships we have to navigate is with our partners in the community violence intervention space. These two fields are close cousins, but they're not twins. And they require different trust networks, different operational boundaries, different specialized skills. A big question I know that I have and have had for some time is many of my peers have as well, is how to collaborate and build bridges across our shared community safety ecosystem so that we can support one another. And likewise, how we make sure we're fighting side by side with our CVI partners when we're so often forced to fight for scraps on the funding side. So to help us untangle this, I'm happy to hand the stage over to Mariela Ruiz-Angel, and she's joined by a powerhouse panel of national experts. So come on up here.
Good afternoon, everybody. I know it is I think we're the last panel of the day, and I appreciate everybody being here. I know sometimes these last kind of sessions can feel heavy, and everyone's like, we're in Chicago. So I do want to thank everybody for sticking around for this. So today, we wanted to have this conversation. Max just had I love that phrase. When we think about community violence interruption and intervention and community crisis response, they are like cousins, right? But they're very, very different. And so across the communities and across the nations, we are actually seeing, that growth happen very fast. Right? From when we first started this, we were at 30 programs, then we were at 80 programs, and I think we're closer to 140 programs now nationally in just the community response areas. That doesn't even include CVI. So I think we're definitely demonstrating that when we're responding to harm, crisis, and conflict, there's lots of ways to reduce these issues, right? And we don't have to do it in traditional enforcement ways. I think the one commonality, and somebody said this earlier, is I think we can all agree that we really are hoping to do this work without sending police, right? The least interaction with police is the best interaction that we want. And so we really are trying to figure out how to do this in a way that we can really approach and expand these programs, but also start to have a conversation about if these fields of practice can align within a larger ecosystem without losing what makes them effective, without losing what makes them authentic and community-based, and what ends up having those really good outcomes. And for some, I will tell you, it's really exciting. We see programs who are doing this really well, trying to work these two types of fields, but it also can raise some important concerns, right? We know that there's some challenges. And so we really want to talk today a little bit about what that looks like. We have two different histories. We have different populations that we serve. And we just know that we also have different workforces and different issues, just alone on the community, right? CVI work and the CCRT work. And yet somehow we also have very similar types of ways that we do it. So today is really about this conversation. I will say that it is a power panel. I've got folks who have been doing this work their whole lives, who have been doing boots on the street forever, and so I definitely am excited about today's conversation. So to jump right in, I'll ask my panelists to introduce themselves and then help answer a quick question to start us off, which is, when you think about the future relationship between CVI and alternative response, where do you see opportunities for alignment, and where do you think clear distinctions must remain? And I'll start with Soledad.
Just introductions?
Introductions and just an answer to the question. Yeah.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Soledad Adriancen McGrath. I am the program director for the Gun Violence Prevention and Justice Reform Program at the Joyce Foundation here in Chicago. So I've been doing this work, I'm a lawyer. I've been doing this work for over 20 years in multiple justice reform spaces, violence intervention, juvenile justice, criminal justice. And when I think about this question that you've asked, I start from the premise of we have to start thinking about a broader public safety ecosystem and what our respective roles, our shared roles and responsibilities, and the shared accountability looks like to our communities. And so it is important that we think about clarity of roles. And I think it's been flagged multiple times, not just today, but yesterday. We have to have clarity of roles. We're responding to different situations, and each situation requires a specific response. That we think about the humanity of the work that we're doing, the communities, the individuals, and also thinking about, of course, sustainability and the political will that's needed. And I think that's where we can start to see some alignment as we think about expanding the definition of a public safety ecosystem.
Eddie?
Well, good afternoon. Welcome to Chicago. I am Eddie Bocanegra, former senior advisor to the Assistant Attorney General with the Department of Justice, but currently Chief Program Officer at Centers for Employment Opportunity, which is a workforce reentry organization. I think the way that I kind of think about your question is there is so much alignment between these two ideas of like community gun violence, CVI efforts, and alternative responses, and quite a bit of alignment, but also it's important to, as Soledad pointed out, there's also some boundaries that we also have to acknowledge and understand. I think alternative to policing, for example, is founded in the principles of there are other ways to addressing community issues beyond law enforcement. And when I think about public safety and I think about community violence prevention services, I think about that is another way that you create public safety by engaging community, by thinking about long-term investments in relationships, which is often an area that is, I would say, either misunderstood or not enough research around it because it's very difficult to assess the quality of relationships. And if you think about it, programming at its best really depends on the interactions and the relationships that service providers actually have with the client or participants of services. And I think that is one of many ways that we could think about the alignment of how there are alternatives to policing or to public safety.
Lisa?
Hi, everyone. Great to see everybody's face again. I am Lisa Chowdhury, the Executive Director for Reimagining Justice / Patterson Healing Collective. And I shared a little bit on the first day about how we got into this work, but I'm just going to give a little bit of details because I think it answers your questions. Our program has been effective for 5 years. We've been able to bring down gun violence. Never did I think, as a leader and my staff that's here, that during the work, one of our staff members would have a mental health crisis, right, and be killed at the hands of the police. And we're so used to responding to, crisis because, when a person is ready to harm someone, that is a crisis, right? We know how to de-escalate. We know how to intervene. We know how to disrupt those cycles of violence. So it was, it was shocking. I'm gonna point to my partner here, KC. KC is a well-known person in the community. Everybody calls KC all the time, including the police sometimes. But for some reason that day, even though he was the field operations director for Patterson Healing Collective, even though our reputation was so good, everybody knows the work that he's done. He is a lifelong advocate in Patterson. For that day when he wanted to support our brother Najee, they didn't let him in. And we got into this work because we were like, why not? Why did you think that shooting him was the response that we needed? And this work kind of fell on our lap, not because, we thought about that like intentionally, right? It was like, oh hell no, we're not gonna ever let anybody else die at the hands of police when people are being, people are going through a crisis. So that's how we got into this work. So when you talked about where's the alignment is that, we already knew our community was in crisis, right? And that they needed healing. And unfortunately, because the only response was police for a long time, right? Even when it was gun violence, they were being sent to prison, or there was no other recourse, right? But then we created an alternative. We said, nah, these are victims, right? These are survivors. We need to support them. And now, after what happened to Najee, we realized, hold on, right? You're coming with SWAT for a person that's just having a bad day? No, we got to create another response. But the difference is also, unfortunately, because there's nothing else in the community, people are already calling us, right? They're like, hey, we don't want another Najee to happen to my son. Can you please come? But it's very important for us to understand that there's a specific type of training that our staff needs when they're going to respond, right? There's a specific type of funding they need. They have to have specific relationships. And there's a different modality of how we're going to do this work. So I think that differentiation always has to happen if we're going to start embarking on this in this new field.
Awesome. Thank you. Sam?
Yep, sorry for that.
Try not to
also.
destroy.
Yeah, I'm dropping everything. I'm dropping everything.
You got it.
Sam Vaughn, City of Richmond's Office of Neighborhood Safety. And I'm very, very new to the field of alternative response. I believe we just had our 90 days worth of data that we're putting in to responding. I'm very familiar with gun violence intervention, gun violence interruption, CVI work. I've been doing it for 18 years. And I believe that I was a complete advocate of this does not need to sit in the same space. I fought that for a long time. And when it came to Richmond, they were saying, you need to do it. You need to do it. I was like, no, ain't no way. And I held that stance for almost 2 years. And then I remember when I finally, it's coming, it's gonna be here. If it's gonna be done effectively, all right, who better? And who better to make sure that the work that's being done right now is not negatively affected by this new work. And so I felt the responsibility, and I'm sitting here looking at Daniela, because when I came to this conclusion, I was at the National Office of Violence Prevention Network convening on a panel, and I blurted that out, like, yep, this is sitting in my lap. And Daniela came up to me and was like, oh my God, let me, you know what I'm saying? Like, this is amazing. And we did a 2-year study with other jurisdictions that's sitting in government that has this umbrella of community safety with alternative response as well as gun violence intervention to try to get it right. Because either one fails, it can destroy the other, and it can take away from every other community that's really trying to be effective in doing this work. Because I hold dear to the stats that Richmond has provided to allow so many other communities across this country to say, see, it works. And they point to us, and it works. And they can, that stats that do it, 90%. We just had the lowest amount of homicides in our history since we've been keeping data. And when we started, we stayed on the top 10 most dangerous cities in this country. Look, itty bitty ass city, and we stayed. It was just violent for no reason. And we addressed it in an appropriate way that was allowing the community to be seen, the community to be heard, the community to be felt. And now we get that opportunity to do this with the alternative response as well. So I take it very serious. I have a great team. I might be the only person in this building that brought his fire chief, his police chief, his dispatch manager, because we serious about this work in Richmond. So I thank y'all for that.
Thank you all. I appreciate it. So we're going to start on this side. So Eddie, I want to start with you. We've now talked about this kind of broad, so I think we're level set. From your perspective, what is gained by thinking beyond individual programs and towards this broader system?
So I'm going to try to, there's so much that I can say to this, and I want to appeal to the audience with a couple perspectives in my journey in doing this work. And I want to start by saying, like, I remember when I was an executive director of the YMCA, I had about 500 kids. Most of them were on probation. And it took I would constantly be arguing that we needed more funding for services. And shortly after that, I went to lead an initiative called Ready Chicago, READI, which stood for Rapid Employment Development Initiative. And it was funded by some amazing foundations here in Chicago. And it gave me the flexibility to not only think about services, but to think about ways that we can empower the staff and our participants to think about policy changes. So here's what I mean by this. Programs are really essential to be able to deliver a service so that you could address the need now. And that is life-saving work. There is so much that we have to do there, and there's so much that we have to also continue to do to get better at services, particularly around the nonprofit, because a lot of times it becomes a number game. And we deliver a service, but sometimes because of the pressures that we're under, we are kind of blindsided by the fact that individuals have more than just one or two issues that they're grappling with. So what that means is how are we intentionally building an ecosystem around the individual and the individual's families? So that's one thing that I want to mention. But the thing going back to Ready, and even why I'm at CEO right now, is because I see some familiar faces, and I'm going to shout out Orlando, Mayorga, Quentin Williams, and a few other folks that I see here whose journey, right, in life, these are individuals that are shaping policies. So we're going beyond the individual level because there's people who are doing that work, and we still got to continue to support that. But unless we change structures and systems and barriers to the people that are impacted by the same systems, we're just going to be chasing our tail around. There's a lot of lessons that I learned when I was at DOJ about how funding, how government moves with taxpayers' dollars. And I will tell you that for me, it's about how do we take every opportunity that we can to empower people to become more civic engaged, either at the local level or at the national level. And that requires not just the advocacy to change policy, but the implementation of those policies, which often, as I recall my friend Quentin constantly remind me, gets overlooked. We pass laws and they stay on the shelf because there's really not enough movement behind what does it take then to take those policy changes into implementation. And so, like, for me, I'll summarize by saying that individual services is amazing. We needed to support people now, but long-term strategy, we have to think about the structures that are creating the conditions in which why we even have programs to begin with.
Thank you so much. Soledad, tell me, as we think about funders increasingly having interest in supporting the conditions that help community safety work endure, rather than only funding individual programs, what opportunities does that create, and what risks should funders also be attentive to?
I do want to flag that funders can play, private philanthropy can play a very important role in piloting or supporting pilots, supporting innovation, and taking risks that the public sector may not be able to take. So to the point of funding some programs, I'm going to share a little bit of the journey that Chicago has undergone in the CVI space, in part because as I've sat with you all these past couple of days, I've heard so much that is parallel to the experience that we had here in Chicago as the work has evolved, and some of the same challenges that the field of alternative response is wrestling with. So if we start with 2016, when the city was really dealing with the crisis of the uptick in gun violence, and we were, as a funding community, trying to figure out what we could do, coordination became really critical. And the coordination among the private funding community was the catalyst for what's called the Partnership for Safe and Peaceful Communities. And that is now a group of over 50 donors that have been investing, aligning their resources, which if you don't know the private philanthropic community, that's a fairly significant thing, align their resources around a common set of strategies that were focused on addressing this issue. And that allowed for the piloting and the innovation that started a lot of this work of where we are today, Ready Chicago, Communities Partnering for Peace. And it wasn't just at the community-led strategies, it was investing in policing as well. But the point was the coordination and the ability that that coordination facilitated that innovation. That coalition helped support the community-led infrastructure that now exists. I'm so proud of what Chicago has been able to do in the community violence intervention space in terms of building a real violence prevention infrastructure that is community-led, that is responding to community need, and has been able to demonstrate some real impact in our city with the reductions that we're seeing in gun violence. It's not to say that it's perfect. It's not to say that there isn't an incredible amount of work still yet to do. We are still losing lives. Mothers are still grieving. Families are still suffering. But we are making progress. And that's important to hold on to. And nationally, we see that the CVI field is also strengthening itself, solidifying itself as a field, recognizing and fighting for legitimacy, the legitimacy and credibility of an emerging workforce, which you have all talked about as well in the alternative response space. And I think that's some real opportunity as we think of the outreach community, the violence interrupter, the fight for designation as a first responder, in the same way that our traditional first responders are recognized. That's important because that has policy implications, that has budgetary implications. And then the last piece is really the public partnership. And you hear a lot of negative things about Chicago and Illinois in the news, but getting really technocratic and into the weeds, we have a Government Alliance of Safe Communities, GASC. City, county, Avigdor, Cook County, a key leader in our space here. City, county, state leadership working together, and I mean weekly working group meetings, discussing how they're going to align their strategies, their dollars, to meet community need. How do they align their grant applications to reduce the burden on communities or community-led organizations that are applying, sometimes for the first time, for public dollars and being faced with a 100-page application? Right? Those are significant technocratic, day-to-day, bread and butter type of things that you have to work through, but it's possible. And so I think there's a lot we can learn from what the CVI field is experiencing and still going through. It's not that it's been resolved. We're having definitional issues, right? How do we define what is CVI and what isn't? I think the same parallel conversations are happening in the alternative response space. How do we define the fields? What's included, what isn't? So I see opportunity there. Actually, I will stop there.
Yeah. No, that was really, really helpful. And I'm sure other cities can relate where it's worked very nicely like that and where it hasn't. So I'm going to go to our practice folks. I say that because I know everyone's been doing this work on the street, but for Lisa and Sam, I want to talk a little bit about what this alignment actually looks like in the field, in practice with responders. So Sam, I'll start with you. You know, Richmond, you mentioned Richmond's one of the few cities who's doing this, right, where it was CVI stuff, and now you're doing alternative work. So I really want to understand, for those that are here who are boots on the street, who run these programs, what does that look like operationally? And where have you found that there's been natural alignment? Like, oh yeah, this makes sense. Whereas other times it feels like it's forced. And then the big question, how do you keep separation where it's needed and then unification where it's also needed? Like, how do you bear with all those? It's a loaded question. So
Still trying to figure that out. But what I will say is, so what I did, and I encourage other folks in other communities, I asked the community. And so as they were literally trying to force this down my throat, and all of my arguments against it, like how this would be in conflict with the work that we do, I went to the community and I was asking our youngsters. And so when I told one youngster, he was like, what's going on? Like, so I told him, this is the thought, this is what they're trying to do. What do you think? And so he was like, so if I'm sitting in front of the park, playing my music loud, smoking on my blunt, like, y'all gonna come instead of police? Yeah, I'm with that, right? And so it was the selling factor for me. And so, but then to get them to understand, like, this is in alignment with law enforcement, so to speak. Like, we are a part of that system, which is completely different than what we do over here, right? And so you have to be able to have the community support. You have to get their insight, their feedback, their understanding. Because if you're saying we're here for you, you got to allow them to be involved in the process of creating what that's supposed to look like. And gratefully, because we had such a great relationship, decade of work plus, so we let them create what that needed to look like for them. And because it has our stamp of approval, it's going to be okay. We're going to be fine in Richmond. I don't know. I can't say that for many other communities. I don't know how it looks. Like, I can see it be a real issue if you're doing alternative response, and then you connect that brand with CVI afterwards. It might be a harder sell. Because they're going to connect that co-response or that alternative response as like law enforcement, so to speak, until we change that narrative, and that messaging. And so we got it easy, and we're going to do fantastic. We're going to do great, and the alignment is amazing because there's already times where our CCRP folks have helped our O&S clientele. And then we've had folks that has contacted CCRP where the responders are like, I think this is a better fit for O&S, right? Like, this dude's calling the police because his kid is carrying guns and doing all that, right? There's nothing we could do. And so we connected them with O&S. Yep. And so we're helping folks who have lost family members from a CCRP call, and we're helping folks who carrying guns with O&S. And it's amazing.
can you talk a little bit about that contention around the relationship with, right? You said it earlier. When we're talking about alternatives or community crisis response, there is a reason to align with police, right? Especially for diverting
If you're going to do it
calls from
effectively.
911. But on the other side, we also want to keep our credible messengers, right? Not necessarily in the same sync, right? They might need to in behind the scenes, but what does that look like from an operational standpoint?
So I'm again, Richmond is we're a unicorn. Excuse me. And so I came, as I mentioned earlier, I came here with the chief of police. 2 years ago, I ain't never traveling nowhere with that man. And so I had to really understand that I had to wear different hats. And again, that was, I guess, my contention to the evolution that was coming. It's here. We have to evolve. And so I got a great chief of police, and he understands. And so he'll sit there and do a thumbs up in a picture with me because I got my CCRP hat on. and then he will walk right by me and not say a goddamn word at a homicide scene. And so you got to have good leadership. And he lets his staff know, his you know, like they understand. And again, mistakes will be made. I get that, human nature. But they do well. They understand our purpose. They understand why we exist. They can appreciate our outcomes. And so they function with us well.
So Lisa, I'm gonna go to you because you talked a little bit about, right, the call to action, folks trusting you, wanting you to do more, right? That you guys created your program that without intention on doing mental health, but here you are. So tell me about how, as we think about community organizations who are often asked to expand beyond their original mission, what happens when the community demands that broader response? How do you answer the call to do more without also, right, while protecting your integrity, your mission, your people, and the original reason for your work?
Similar to Sam, I asked my team. I was like, what do you guys think about this? I didn't want to just put this on them. I know I mentioned Raquel, our sister from Salvation and Social Justice. They were already working on passing a bill around this, right? And then what happened to us, the tragedy that happened to us, I was already in conversations with her thinking about where should this bill go, because we do so much advocacy and policy work, not even thinking about doing the frontline work for it, right? More of, hey, our community needs more alternative responses. And from that, when Najee died, we were like, can we name it the Seabrooks Washington bill, right? And then it just became, where our team was, they're testifying, right, as far as to the committees to make sure that it got passed. And then it was like, well, do we want to execute this? Do we want to do this on the ground, guys? Because, it's going to be a whole different workload. We're already traumatized, right? We're already dealing with high rates of gun violence. We're already dealing with, how we process that. Some of them are close loved ones that we care about when they're getting harmed, right? Now, what do you think about this now? And they were all for it. And to be quite honest, we're already getting the calls, right? So now it's like, how do we use this way to build our capacity and get trained better? And then the second part came as we're building this, right, asking the community, what do you need? How should this look? Do you feel comfortable? I'm going to give you guys how real this is, right? A month ago, right? We didn't launch our CCRT. All we did was just say, hey, community, guess what? We finally got the contracts. We're very transparent on our social media because I don't want anybody to think that this is a money grab for us or any of the things that we do, right? Hey, family, CCRT, we finally got our contracts. We're training our team. We're building this out for you, right? What do you want? We want your feedback, right? And our social media is very active. But because of that, there was a crisis where a SWAT-style militaristic police response was provided. And we were getting blown up on our, how you get your DM, they call you, and my phone was blowing up, my staff was blowing up, everybody was calling us, right? And I was like, guys, the family was calling us, and I was like, we can't respond yet, and I'm just gonna be quite honest with you, they're not trained yet. And I don't wanna be a disservice. I know you want us there, right? But I don't wanna be a disservice to you. I wanna make sure our team is, and they were like, please just come, just be the eyes. And I was like, all right, so I talked to my team. I was like, are you guys okay? And they, my team will say yes to anything. They love their community, right? We all love our community. They ran there. It was about 4 blocks away, right? They literally ran there. And do you guys know that and it gets me choked up because that whole community started clapping for them when they arrived at the scene. That's how hurt they are, right? Because they don't want to lose somebody else like that, like how we lost Najee. So this is real, this is real for us. And then I had to think about them processing that, right? Because every time they arrive to a scene like that, they're like, man, I hope we don't lose, this person, because it becomes re-triggering for them because it's this Najee again, right? My team was out there comforting the mom, right? Because the mom was like, and they all said it. They were like, we don't want we don't want another Najee. I don't want them to kill them like how they killed Najee. And we had to calm her down. Then KC was by the police, hey, I'm here, and we wanted the young man to hear our voice, right? And to this day, that young man is in our community group. Remember I told you guys we created a community advisory group? And he says to this day, I only believe that nothing happened to me is because you guys were there. So we understand the importance of this, right? But we want to be very intentional in how we design this, because we never want to. Brandon has had to go to, because we're on social media. We're linked to everybody in the community, right? Brandon saw a suicide note on social media, and he was able to lead the police to the site where the young lady hung herself. This is how real it is, right? And can I tell you how funny this is? While he was on his motorbike, the police were behind him, and the community thought they were chasing him. They were trying to like, yo, don't go, don't, like, Brandon, watch out, But he was like, no, they're with me. Like, this is, because we have this trust issue, right? So I think a part of our work right now is developing that trust, because we have a lot of healing to do with our law enforcement. I'm just gonna be quite honest with you, right? But it's getting there, right? Now, what happened, like, for example, that barricade situation that I just explained, I had our hospital partners call the chief of police and say, hey, my team is out there. Please just tell your officers, to understand we're just there as eyes and ears. We're not gonna intervene, right? But we just need this to be done right for their safety, for their well-being, and for the community. And I think that those things matter, right? Because now we're not just coming in trying to storm their scene, but also you have to understand that the community trusts us, and when we're there, you have to do right by us. So I know that was a lot of stuff, but in real time, this is what it's looking like for us. And yes, there has to be a separation for me for our CVI work, but I do think it's important to build the capacity of our team, because the reality is, because our community wants us there, we have to make sure that they're trained properly, they're resourced properly, and also I'm not burning them out. Yep. Right.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for walking us through that in such detail. And I didn't earlier get to say, unfortunately, Deputy Mayor Lakeisha York couldn't be here, because she's literally doing that, right? She's front line right now, trying to keep the peace, make sure people aren't hurt in Newark right now, where they're having some contention with their detention centers and the situation they're in. So this is the work. This is how we had to figure out how to keep that people from getting hurt. So I'm going to ask Eddie just to kind of jump on that, just because I know you and I have had some really great conversations about workforce. And how we think about that infrastructure, right? Because we're both seeing a growth, right? We need more training. You've said it now too, Lisa. We're needing to find some sort of standardization as we think about how we want to become, right, more professional in this, how we want to be seen in the future. Tell me a little bit more what you think that infrastructure might look like, and what do we need to have in place to be able to move in that direction where we can really increase workforce?
Yeah, sure. So I want to share a couple thoughts as I answer your question. I think there's a misconception about the people who are doing the CVI work, or for responders, or alternatives to law enforcement. All those different things can mean different things to different people. And for each one of those things, right, as I hear my colleagues talk about the incidents that happened both in Richmond and the respective cities, many who are in this room as well, it's really important that we acknowledge that this work is not charitable work. That's the first thing that I want to just point out there. And so then how do we build a narrative around how meaningful this work really is, and the people who are doing this work? And then I would just unpack that by also thinking and asking all of us, right? What are the skill sets do you think are required to do this kind of service within community? Often you would expect an executive director to wear multiple hats, and I think that's also unfair. You expect government, law enforcement, police officers to also be social workers when they've never been trained as social workers. And so I think there's a need for clarity around what are the skill sets, what are the kind of trainings, and also equally important, but often overlooked, what's the kind of coaching and supervision that is needed to support those frontline staff people, and your managers for that matter. I think that the other part that I'll just point out here is that as we think about the different components of the work that we're doing, I think about what are the policies. I keep going back to the policies, right? How do we change the structures? How do we change the policies? How do we do some more bridge building within our community, local partners, our faith community, learning institutions, law enforcement, but to recognize that collaboration, right, needs to be defined. Partnerships need to be defined. And there's like some rules of engagement that needs to be both created, co-created, honored, respected, and people should be held accountable to honoring those rules. I think often too many of us are talking to the, speaking to the choir. Too often people end up going rogue in this kind of work because of different pressures, different funding streams, different new governments, all those different things. And I think that there's a need to really create an environment to think about like how do you sustain this work long term. I think the other thing that I want to point out when it comes to just like training and building an infrastructure is building the language that we need, and thinking about how do we look at this work, not just like an immediate next several months or next year or two, but how do we sustain this work in the next 10, 15 years? Because if you look at other disciplines, think about how long it took them to really think about, I think about, for example, we don't ever question childhood development. And in fact, if you do the research around that, years ago when it first started, it failed. We don't question it anymore. We don't question returning veterans around PTSD or moral injury. We don't do that anymore. We become more empathetic towards veterans who are struggling in their trauma. But why are we not so empathetic with the people and the communities that we're working with and the people who are doing this work? And I'm probably going to guess it's because it looks like most of the people in this room, or because many of them have had interactions with the justice system, and so therefore their lives are defined differently or valued differently. And you don't have to look too far. Just look at your local government, whether it's city, state, or county, where their money's going. I love the comment that Soledad pointed out, because think about how many millions, I forgot what the county was putting out there, but I think collectively it was like $250 million to support public safety CVI. That's not including another $100 million from the business community. And that's also not including all the money that philanthropy put into this as well. And it's still not enough. So until we change those structures, right, and we think about like how do we develop people in a space to actually deliver the services and think about the advocacy that is needed, we're going to continue to be wrestling with these challenges.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much. So as we think about what makes alignment work, Soledad, I want to go back to you a little bit about what, we're in a tough situation right now, I think, nationally. And so I don't know if when we think about how we create foundational infrastructure in certain environments, I'm curious to find out what conditions you think are needed before communities can really begin moving forward in this kind of direction as we think about an ecosystem, as we think about growing their programs. I mean, it's a tough time. I think people are feeling it. And so I'm just curious to see if you could help answer that.
Yeah, it's such a hard question because I think it presumes that we need to wait for some perfect condition to be in place, and you've clearly all demonstrated that that's not possible and it's not necessary. You need to respond to the needs of your community now, and I think CVI experiences the same pressure and urgency. And I don't mean to be reductionist when I talk about coordination. I do think, though, that coordination happening at multiple levels was really critical for us locally to be able to advance one piece of the public safety ecosystem, the community-led violence prevention ecosystem. And that coordination happened at multiple levels, not just at the private philanthropic level, but it facilitated coordination among community organizations that historically, because people weren't doing this just since 2016, obviously. The communities have been doing this for many, many years prior to 2016. But it facilitated coordination and conversation, hard conversations, trust building among community organizations that historically were forced to be competitors because you were all competing for limited resources. And then, of course, the level of coordination at the public sector was really critical. Even though it's not enough, we need more. It was really critical to at least get public infrastructure in place to be able to support that work. And so I think it's a multiple lever, multi-layered level of coordination. I can't understate the level of trust that's needed and the relationships that need to be built and nurtured to facilitate those really hard conversations when things are not going well, because things won't always go well. And then an expansion of the stakeholders that are at the table. One thing we haven't talked about is research. And data and research, not super exciting when you're talking about needing to save a life in the moment. But policymakers, if we're talking about the policy that's needed to be able to sustain this work, often need to see some kind of impact. And so the philanthropic community can be a partner in that space to help build the evidence base. Often it may be just validating what you already know and what you see in your community that works. But some of those data points have different audiences and need different kinds of messages. And so I think the research community, and I'll say the research community in particular, that is willing to be at the side of the community partners, community engaged research, participatory action research is especially critical in these spaces, because they can help amplify the stories that you're already seeing and experiencing on the ground. So coordination, trust building, I think those are critical. We certainly can't understate the value of having that public safety partner, or that public partnership at the table to be able to have those conversations. And then the last thing I will mention, and I think this is really important in terms of what we're all trying to work towards, is how we define success and how we define the outcomes that we're working towards. Because I think whether you're in the CVI space or you're in the alternative response space, you're working towards safe communities. You want to heal communities, but the way that you're being measured is going to be different. And in the gun violence prevention space, where Joyce is very much involved in working in that area, often we're measuring by whether shootings go up or down, right? Fatal, non-fatal shootings. And so are we holding a CVI organization to that metric? That is a hard number to be constantly fighting against. And we all know that that is not the definition of safety. Of course, we have to measure those numbers. We want to see those numbers go down, absolutely. We want it to be zero. But until we get to that point and we know what it takes to change a life, not just in the gun violence prevention context, but in the mental health, behavioral health context, what it means not just to change an individual life, how long it takes, the amount of work and dedication that you're pouring into it. Changing a life, then changing a potential neighborhood, and then changing a community, and having that impact ripple throughout an entire city, that takes time. And so we have to have, I think, an alignment around what success means so that we can talk to our policymakers and reset expectations around success in this space.
So super well said. Thank you so much. And I think a lot really relatable as we think about alternatives, right? It's one of the things that we talk about all the time is the perception of what alternatives or community crisis response teams are meant to be doing. Are we there to save all the unsheltered individuals? Are we there to make sure that, right, we're not only addressing the crisis, but then also making sure that people get the long-term help? I mean, the list starts to become on, and how we really think about how we're really going to think, how we're going to be able to message that too, right? I think is really important, and control narrative as we're growing and expanding. So I want to ask one last question from each panelist as we start to wrap up today. And again, I want to thank all of you for being here and just starting to have the dialogue, right? Thank you, Soledad. I think that's exactly true. Is what it's we got to start having this conversation, because someone's going to have it with or without us, and I want to make sure I'm at the table for sure. So anybody can feel to start, but I would love to know 5 years from now, as perspective for those who this is their first time coming. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we had 150 people show up to a little convening that was like just to start the conversation. Last year we had 300 people come to New York City, and today I think we had about 450, I think is our number. So, you know, some of us have already dreamed of what this looks like in 10 years. I think we'll have a much, much bigger space. But I also think we'll be in a different ecosystem, a different place, hopefully around safety. And I would love to know from each of you, as we wrap up, 5 years from now, what is the one thing you hope has changed about how communities think and even talk about safety?
For me, is that we're recognized as first responders, period. We are just as essential as police, firearm, all that kind of stuff. So that's my goal, and that's, I believe, it should be a lot of our goals, that we get recognized and we're considered first responders.
Ditto. And I swear, as soon as I get home, I'm talking to a senator about trying to get that on our state legislation, because I was talking with the chief, and he's like, that's a no-brainer. But somebody has to do the movement, and so I'm working on that as soon as I get home. Holla. And then, you know, secondly, me and the doc gonna be talking about how the Joyce Foundation is funding our work, because as of right now, like I ain't, you know, okay, and I got you. But yes, but the fact that because CVI work has been frowned upon like forever. My concern, my fear, and what I will combat is to not let alternative response, which is crucial in our communities, diminish CVI work, because it's everybody looks at the work of CVI because them folks don't deserve nothing but death or prison. But, oh, this guy, he's going through this issue, or this young lady, she has this, they deserve compassion. They deserve love and kindness. And so then that can take the place of a community saying we're thinking outside of the box when we're trying to care for our community. And it just, we go right back to the same with youngsters who just willing to be violent because they hurt. And so I that's my concern, and that's what I will combat in Richmond, and I encourage you all to pay attention to that in your community as well.
Thank you.
Sure. Just recently, we wrapped up a report by the CVI Action Plan, in which we traveled pretty much across the country. Either we traveled or through webinars and meetings to learn more about what the field in CVI really needed, how they defined it, what are our assets, our strengths, and our challenges. And there's been some real large investments, not just here in Chicago, but elsewhere. Some who are in this room right now, Beth, I see you, Beth, I see you back there, who believe in this work. And what I hope that 5-10 years from now, that we really build on the evidence that is being collected at the cost of people's lives and people sacrificing their lives and time, just like the young man that was mentioned earlier today. You know, while the CVI in its term is relatively new, the work, if you look at Thrasher, who's a sociologist here out of Chicago, in the 1930s, 1940s, issues around gangs and gang detachment, all that, like this, like, it's not new. And I wonder, like, why haven't we collectively in government really funded this in a way that would make the most sense? I was at DOJ recently, as I mentioned earlier. Through bipartisan support, we were able to pass, I say we, at the time I was not at DOJ, but $250 million to support CVI efforts. And then shortly after, I got hired at DOJ to actually lead those efforts, where and what we should be funding. And I think about $250 million, right? And I think about my budget before I went to DOJ was between $18, $20 million for 3 communities in Chicago. So I want you to put that in perspective. $18 to $20 million, 3 communities in 1 city. And you have $250 million at the federal level. It just felt so unfair. So my hope is that the work that many of us in this room have been leading or investing or pushing or doing the work is that we continue this work, to continue to mine the evidence, to continue the advocacy, to change policies, so that more likely next administration, we're not just a $250 million budget, but it's a $5 billion budget. And so the folks in this room and your organizations and the people you serve and the community you serve can really benefit from real quality services, which also means that we have the next 3 years to think about how do we build that bench. So.
I'm a Peruvian immigrant. And what I hope is for us to have a different conversation or a more nuanced conversation around safety and what we mean when we talk about safety and bringing safety to our communities. Because it cannot be governed just by the numbers I mentioned, the statistics. I'm going to end where I started, on the humanity. My favorite poet is a Peruvian poet by the name of César Vallejo, and he has a beautiful poem. I just want to share one line with you. Hay golpes en la vida tan fuertes, yo no sé. There are blows in life so fierce, I just don't know. And I think all of you feel that every day in your work. And so my hope is that we have a different conversation around safety, not just so that we as individuals are safe, but that we're thinking about our communities in a more expansive way and thinking about thriving and what it means to thrive. For a child to thrive, for a neighborhood to thrive, for our communities to thrive, so that we can then build the systems and policies and workforce in a way that really unites us towards that common goal.
Beautifully said, yes, thank you. Well, obviously, we are coming to our time. The question is not whether or not these conversations happening. They are. They're already happening today. And safety isn't a police word. It's a word that we all need to be figuring out what that means for each of us, each of our communities, each of our people, our gente. So again, I want to thank everyone. I also selfishly, there are lots of research coming out around these ecosystems. We are one at the Center for Innovation and Community Safety, and I think we're hoping to really share that report with our CVI partners and start seeing where we can start seeing that alignment. Does it make sense? Do these definitions line up? So I encourage you we have a table outside, go look at them. We have links to them. We definitely want to start having these conversations more often in our communities. So again, I want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you.